Hi everyone, Sean here and welcome to another episode of Lines in Sand. Today we're going to go on another deep dive around another popular theory regarding the Great Pyramid at Giza. That is Jean-Pierre Houdin's very interesting internal ramp theory. I have a few of these deep dives planned, and it's really good to get under the skin of some of the most popular theories surrounding the mysteries of the Great Pyramid and really examine the details. So, as with the previous theory deep dive video, which was on the Orion correlation theory, I will link it below in case you want to check it out. As with that video, this one will be split into three main parts. Part 1, this fairly small intro part, will give an overview of what the internal ramp theory is, what it aims to prove, and some of the key players involved. The second part of the video, which will be the biggest part, will examine the main supporting publication for this theory, that being Bob Brier's book, The Secret of the Great Pyramid, which is a fantastic read, honestly. Bob Brier takes Houdin's theory and rewrites, hypothetically of course, the construction of the pyramid year by year, using Houdin's propositions to tell the story in real time. Houdin himself is credited as a second author for the book, understandably so, but it is to my knowledge that the whole thing is penned by Brier, even though it relies heavily on Houdin's theories. The third and final part of the video will focus on criticism of the theory. Personally, from what I've seen online, reaction to Jean-Pierre Houdin's internal ramp theory over the years has been fairly positive, but as we know, every theory has its detractors. Evidence against the theory then will go here in part 3. I'll then offer my own closing thoughts for what they're worth to round out the video, so without further fanfare or introduction, let's get stuck in. What then is the internal ramp theory? The internal ramp theory is a popular alternative Great Pyramid construction theory proposed by French architect Jean-Pierre Houdin. The foundation of the theory actually started with Houdin's father, Henry Houdin, but it was perfected and fleshed out by Jean-Pierre after many years of creating and then working with computer simulations of the Great Pyramid. Houdin proposes that the ramp that was used to build the Great Pyramid is actually inside the structure. The full body of his work not only proposes an internal ramp was used, but also that a series of counterweight systems were used to construct certain elements of the structure, such as the Granite King's Chamber. His theory also addresses the methods used to mount the original Pyramidion upon the top of the pyramid, and generally tries to answer just about every architectural and design question about how the Great Pyramid was built. Initially, Houdin follows the more generally accepted external ramp theory in order for the main bulk of the pyramid to be completed. Before this ramp becomes too steep, however, the construction switches then to an internal ramp model that is built along with the pyramid, and the external ramp, admittedly much smaller than any other external ramp proposed, is then dismantled and brought into the pyramid itself. In more recent times, Houdin has written about the recent scan pyramids discoveries and has written these into explanations as to how they can also fit with his internal ramp theory. But for the purposes of this video, let's go back to 2008, where the book about this theory was first published. Reading Bob Brier's The Secret of the Great Pyramid. Bob Brier's book is split into two main threads. One is a modern-day account of his introduction to Jean-Pierre, his work and his theory, and then the progress of how the theory developed, the tools that were used, and the contacts that were made along the way to push the theory to some official form of publication. The second thread is, as I mentioned at the start of the video, is an alternative historical take of the building of the Great Pyramid using the methods set out by Houdin and his theory. I will try not to confuse the two narratives too much or switch between them too frequently. For the most part, I will be focusing on the pyramid construction narrative rather than the modern day one, as this is where all the pertinent information to the meat of the theory lies. The Secret of the Great Pyramid begins in much the same way as many other books on the pyramids of Egypt, with a seemingly mandatory preamble of a wider historical context. not only of both social and political aspects, but also geographic aspects. There seems to be some sort of unwritten rule among authors where there needs to be a rehash of the cliff notes on the entire history of the Egyptian civilization before getting into the meat and potatoes of any book on the subject. Bob Brier, however, is mercifully brief in this regard, even when it comes to the 3rd Dynasty king Zoser and his architect Imhotep in their building of the Step Pyramid at Saqqara. Brier tracks the evolution, much like Bouval did in the Orion Mystery in our previous deep dive video, from burial pits to mastabas to step pyramids to the wonders that we see today at Giza and other sites. Sneferu's pyramids get a brief recapping, and then it's off to the races with Pharaoh Khufu and his chief architect, Hemenu. Now, I think it's important to remind you all at this point that the passages that follow are part of Bob Brier's narrative, his retelling of the Great Pyramid's construction, undertaken using the information provided by Jean-Pierre Houdin and his computer simulations. When Khufu's predecessor, Sneferu, was boated across the Nile to begin his journey to the afterlife in the West, the clock, or calendar, of ancient Egypt had been reset to day 1. Khufu was the new pharaoh, and his architect Hemenu would be on the case of selecting a new site for his pyramid to be built upon. Now, Brier here points out something very interesting. The architect Hemenu was Sneferu's son. That means the architect of the Great Pyramid of Giza was either the brother or half-brother of Pharaoh Khufu. If this is completely true, then it adds another dimension to the usual, well, the pyramids weren't built for the pharaohs theory, but this is something I'll have to address more fully at another time. Brier informs us that Sneferu had many wives, so we can't be sure of the exact relation of Hemenu and Khufu, but I found this super interesting all the same. Regarding why burials of royalty did not continue at Saqqara, Brier is perhaps vague, citing that, quote, religion and politics dictated the general area of the pyramid. Construction concerns determined the exact site. The narrative continues that Hemenu and his overseers took great care to inspect the Giza site. They would, after all, not be building near a limestone quarry, but more or less in a limestone quarry, and this was one of the major deciding factors in picking Giza as the site for the construction of Khufu's pyramid. Hemenu was also prudent enough, Brier thinks, to plan the construction at Giza in such a way as to leave plenty of room for future pyramids to be built for future kings. You heard it here first, folks, the unified ground plan at Giza confirmed. Work needed to begin fairly soon. Time was of the essence. Khufu had just become king, but Brier writes that Khufu was 40 years old when he took the throne. Work would need to start on his Grand Pyramid project sooner rather than later. It is for this reason, perhaps, that Brier writes that Hemenu made the decision to contain 3 chambers within the Great Pyramid. Now, we have touched on this theory on the channel before, that the 3 chambers of the pyramid, those being the so-called subterranean chamber, the Queen's chamber, and the King's chamber, were basically a contingency plan. If Khufu died earlier in his reign, he would be buried in the subterranean chamber, capped off with some sort of mastaba structure or smaller pyramid. Likewise, further up the pyramid, the Queen's chamber could have acted as a second contingency chamber. And finally, the full-sized project, resulting in the fully completed pyramid and Khufu dying of a ripe old age and being interred into his king's chamber, high up in the Great Pyramid. Personally, I'm still not 100% on whether or not I agree with this theory, but from a construction and contingency standpoint, of course it makes absolute sense. There is, of course, various conflicting narratives, events and theories that muddy things up. For example, there are those who believe that the subterranean chamber was built after the Great Pyramid, and there is a lot of noise around the supposed function of the so-called Queen's chamber, that this wasn't a burial chamber at all and instead some sort of ritual space. Brier, however, for the sake of coming back on track with this video, is steadfast that the entire pyramid and everything inside it was planned from day 1. its height, its width, the internal dimensions of each chamber, everything. Remember that different parts of the Great Pyramid are not only made out of different quality stones, such as filler stones and the more presentable original casing stones, in the example of limestone, but also different types of stone were used for some of the internal chambers, most famously, of course, being the King's Chamber with its monumental slabs of Aswan granite. Not to mention the various different construction techniques that would need to be used for different parts of the pyramid. The incredible Grand Gallery, for example. All of these processes would have been in place in the plan before a single stone was laid on the Giza Plateau. From the works of two Egyptologists, starting with work by Rainer Stadelmann that was expanded on by one Rolf Krauss, it was determined that the Great Pyramid would have taken 20 years to build. The Egyptologists used inscriptions on stones quarried from Sneferu's Red Pyramid to work out that it had taken approximately 11 years to complete that pyramid, and then applied the same logic to the Great Pyramid, taking into account the complexity and size of its construction. There are plenty of people who do not agree that the Great Pyramid was completed in 20 years. Such a structure, built in such an ancient time, could not have been completed in such a short space of time. This tends to be the usual argument against it. However, 20 years is the timeline that Brier uses in this book, which I accept, to be honest with you. I'm heavily giving him the benefit of the doubt because this reconstructed timeline is to explain the pyramid construction using Jean-Pierre Houdin's theories. I see no reason why using the efficient and fascinating construction methods, which we will soon cover in the video, why the pyramid cannot be erected in such a space of time. Brier writes that there would have been a national recruitment drive for able-bodied men to join the quote-unquote cause of building Khufu's pyramid. The theory that the pyramids were built by slaves appears to be long debunked. However, one thing that comes up a lot is that the workforce on royal construction projects often came from the many farmers who could not work during certain periods of the year as part of the annual cycle that included the flooding of the River Nile. Whether these recruited builders, Brier mentions, supplemented these out-of-work farmers that we read of in multiple other sources, or if this is instead a theory that is proposed as an alternative to the seasonal availability of manpower, I'm not quite sure here. Brier goes on to highlight the work of Mark Lehner, who uncovered parts of the temporary village where lots of construction workers lived. They found the remains of houses, granaries, butcher shops, bakeries, and perhaps most importantly, breweries. I'm joking, of course, but this was a fantastic... Well, I'm not joking, they found the breweries, but I'm not saying that's the most important part of the discovery. This was a fascinating discovery, all the same, which gave us enormous insight into how these people lived, how they were treated, and how they ate. Quite well, it seems, in all fairness. The reason I mention this is because Brier points out that once the workers started to arrive at site, this makeshift mud brick town, big enough to hold 25,000 people, would have been the first thing that was needed to have been built. Attention would then have turned to the 4-mile canal that would have been needed to connect the Giza Plateau to the Nile River in order to float materials brought from elsewhere right up to the construction site. Those giant slabs of granite, for example, had to come a long way. But there was also a second quarry used for finer limestone than what could be found directly at Giza, and that was at Tura, about 8 miles away on the other side of the river. The Great Pyramid's facing blocks, now sadly missing from the pyramid in modern times, were extracted from this quarry and brought to Giza. An interesting fact that I did not know until reading this book was that the British Army in World War II stored ammunition in the empty tunnels left behind at the Tura quarry by Khufu and Hemenu's workforce. The second off-site quarry was much further away and would be where the previously mentioned Aswan granite would be quarried for the King's Chamber. Brier writes that the granite would not even be required until approximately the 12th year of construction, but the project required so much of it that work needed to begin far away at the Aswan quarry almost immediately at day one. Granite is As you may know, an impossibly hard stone to work with, and how indeed the Egyptians even worked it at all is a subject of its own, far beyond the scope of this video. But for the sake of Brier's timeline, men were dispatched immediately to Aswan in order to begin the quarrying and dressing of the granite needed for later in the pyramid project. When you think that Khufu could have died at any time, the amount of potentially wasted physical labour here is nothing short of astounding. I mean, imagine that Khufu died by the time the Queen's Chamber was created and was interred there. The poor souls at Aswan would have been working themselves to the bone for the best part of a decade, for no reason. I have no doubt that this stone would have been used elsewhere, and that the ancient Egyptians have every base covered, but what a thought all the same. The amount of work needed just for that one aspect of the project really helps the scale of the Great Pyramid's construction to be felt. For something so massive built so long ago, it can often be difficult to tangibly relate to the scale of the project. Anyway, moving on then to the next stage. Brier attributes the orientation of the pyramid to the 4 points of the compass as done for religious reasons. Interestingly, Brier states that whilst the ancient Egyptians identified an unchanging northernmost point of the night sky, one that is not the same as our North Star today, for example, but one that is constant for the ancient Egyptians all the same, he goes on to say, the deceased pharaoh was associated with this unchanging eternal northern point. Being the astronomy dunce that I am, I immediately started Googling up whether any of the stars in the Orion constellation were perhaps ever sighted that far north, but then I realized that I was being a bit silly. Anyway, Brier mentioned this because he goes on to say that the association between the pharaoh and the north is the reason as to why the pyramid entrances are placed upon their northern face. Unlike some of the previous literature we've gone through on this channel, Brier remains impartial, at least in this text, about whether the alignment of the pyramid and the measuring of true north was achieved by the ancient Egyptians using either an astral or solar method. Circumstantial reasoning is given for both, to be fair, but it's interesting to see that one is not favoured over the other here. Whatever the method, Brier writes, it worked perfectly. But what now that the pyramid's alignment had been decided? How would that super precision level of accuracy be achieved? Small deviations at the bottommost levels of construction could result in extreme deviances by the time the pyramid reached its top. How would everything be kept in line and above board, as it were? Here a suggestion is given of a giant spirit level, to use a modern comparison. I'll quote directly from Brier here as not to muddy this unusual suggestion. A thin trench was cut around the perimeter of the pyramid and filled with water. The level of the water was then traced on the wall of the trench, and that was the starting baseline. The trench could be filled up to the baseline and the rest of the perimeter levelled in accordance with the line. Once the perimeter was level, the first blocks were almost ready to be put in place. Nothing more is given on this, and I've never come across it before, but it is pretty fascinating to think about. I'm not sure how wide or deep this potential trench could have been. Realistically, to have a body of water settle and level out, it wouldn't necessarily need to be all that deep. As long as the level of the water could be referenced when placing the first blocks of the pyramid down, then it would have achieved its desired purpose. Speaking of placing down the first blocks, Brier reminds us that the Great Pyramid was not built on level ground. There was a natural outcropping, a knoll of some kind already in place, and the pyramid was built around this. This is often accounted for in diagrams of the pyramid's internal chambers, as shown in the picture currently on screen. Brier takes this opportunity to switch focus to the first of the 3 internal chambers of the Great Pyramid. As the foundation blocks were assembled on the Giza plateau, digging began into the bedrock of the existing hill, making its way down in a tunnel deep beneath the bedrock, where the subterranean chamber, the first contingency burial chamber, began to take form. Once again, it would be amiss of me if I did not mention that there are people of the opinion that the subterranean chamber predates the Great Pyramid of Giza, and that it was repurposed into the structure when the pyramid was built on top of it. Sometimes this theory extends to the maybe the well shaft or so-called grotto therein, sometimes not. In Brier's narrative, however, it is assumed that the subterranean chamber was created when the pyramid construction began. The reason for the tight dimensions of the descending passage, the first internal corridor to take shape actually, is given as only needing to be big enough to let the king's sarcophagus through. Which is an interesting statement because, quite famously, the sarcophagus used in the king's chamber, assuming it is, of course, Khufu's sarcophagus, would definitely not fit into the subterranean chamber. True enough, the sarcophagus would slide down the descending passage as intended, but the trouble begins when the passage levels out flat. This horizontal entrance to the subterranean chamber is not big enough for the sarcophagus to fit down it. The subterranean chamber is also very different to the chambers above it in the pyramid superstructure. Its dimensions are different, and there are many unusual rock features left inside. In Brier's reconstruction, this could be answered by the fact that the subterranean chamber was left unfinished as the pyramid progressed upwards and the so-called Queen's Chamber became the active contingency chamber. At some point, the blocks of the pyramid caught up with the existing hill in which the subterranean chamber was being carved out, and work stopped on this below-ground space, with all focus now being on continuing upwards. The underground chamber was simply left unfinished. For me, this doesn't explain the giant pit that was dug in the subterranean chamber, nor does it explain the additional single corridor going off towards the south, which was also mysteriously abandoned in a puzzling dead end. It's very true that this does fit a theory that the chamber was simply unfinished. It matches up with the rest of the chamber, the fact that it's just left in a strange state of neither here or there. But it doesn't address why this additional tunnel exists or why there's a pit. Personally, I believe in the theory that the subterranean chamber came either before or after the Great Pyramid. Most likely before is my gut feeling, but I have no immediate evidence either way for this. I have the idea in my head that the dimensions of the horizontal tunnel into the chamber, the one that famously would not fit Khufu's sarcophagus through it, was the original dimension of the entire tunnel system into the subterranean chamber, including the original descending passage before it became the Great Pyramid's descending passage. The descending passage, at least in this hypothetical original bit that existed in the rock of the existing hill, could have later been widened in line with the plans for the internal tunnel system, for the entire new pyramid to be placed on top of the existing knoll, in line with contingency plans. The original horizontal corridor at the bottom into the chamber was never widened out when it became apparent that the chamber would no longer be needed. But I'm just spitballing here. There are too many unanswered questions about the subterranean chamber to write it off as a contingency chamber that went unused. Whether this is the case or not, there is certainly more going on here than just that. Anyway, returning to Brier's reconstruction, the focus as the pyramid rises into the sky switches to the more pressing issue of how the ancient Egyptians raised blocks weighing multiple tons hundreds of feet into the air. This is the first time that ramps are mentioned. Brier suggests that, for pyramid reconstruction up to a maximum of 200 feet, regular external ramps are, quote, neither too massive nor too long to be impractical. Brier has no doubt that Himinu used a single external ramp for the first 200 feet of the Great Pyramid. He proposes a ramp built a quarter of a mile long, facing south towards the limestone quarry at Giza. He suggests that the ramp was split into two parts, the first to facilitate the simultaneous coming and going of new stones coming up and workmen, etc., returning back down without interfering with one another. The second half of the ramp would be under construction up to the desired height of the next level of pyramid construction, and then the roles of these parts would be switched as required, meaning construction on the ramp could continue up as the other part of the ramp was being used to build the pyramid. Up to a maximum of 200 feet, of course, but we're jumping ahead just a little here. Brier now shifts focus to the Queen's Chamber, starting by highlighting its much smaller dimensions in comparison to the subterranean chamber. He suggests almost in an offhand way that Himinu kinda just knew that the pharaoh would outlive the Queen's Chamber phase of construction, as if this is even remotely a satisfactory explanation in any way, shape or form for its size or shape. I'm not saying that that's definitely what Brier is trying to say here, but I don't really know why else it would be mentioned in this way. Either way, if anything, for me, this statement just highlights the stark differences between the Queen's Chamber and the subterranean chamber, not to mention the King's Chamber above it. You'd think if these chambers were 3 chambers as part of the same contingency plan, then they would surely more or less look the same. What would be the significance of making each of these 3 chambers so starkly different to the last? It makes no sense in that regard. Moving on, we see the ceiling of the Queen's Chamber now coming into place. Brier proposes that the rafters of the Queen's Chamber ceiling came into place around 10 years into the construction of the pyramid, placing it somewhere around the halfway point if the 20-year timeline is to be followed. Alongside this unique sloping ceiling, the beginnings of the Grand Gallery was starting to take shape, and the well shaft had been dug out, again it seems for reasons unknown. From previous videos that we've done covering the shaft, using Keith Hamilton's excellent guides to the Great Pyramid, the topmost section of the so-called well shaft is at least clad with masonry blocks, if not cut through them, and the bottommost section of it is rough and hewn out of the natural bedrock. One does wonder what the real purpose of this shaft could be. It is left in Brier's timeline here, but no mention is really given to it, nothing of any significance anyway. Regarding the horizontal corridor leading to the Queen's Chamber, Brier takes a breather from the historical narrative and instead focuses on more modern-day affairs. He talks of Gilles Dumion and Jean-Patrice Houdin, 2 men whose names I've already butchered on this channel once before, and he addresses their work in drilling through the western wall of the Queen's Chamber's horizontal passage. Now, one does not simply walk into the Great Pyramid and drill into one of the chamber walls. I'm sure we all know this. Restrictions were once upon a time much more lax, as we do know, allowing people like Weiss and Caviglia to cause untold amounts of damage with their quote-unquote exploratory methods. No, even in the 1980s and in the 1990s, fairly strict permission was required to proceed with work inside the Great Pyramid. Instead of walking in with a sack full of dynamite like those before them, Dumion and Houdin sought the backing of the French Ministry of Foreign Relations, as well as a private company who were experts in microgravimetric surveying. Together, they approached the Egyptian Department of Antiquities with a proposal. Being less invasive than drilling and digging, etc., the microgravimetry technique seemingly comfortably fitting the Antiquity Department's criteria for a survey rather than an excavation, the French team promised the most in-depth survey ever taken of the Great Pyramid with this new technology. Branding the project Operation Cheops, they took thousands of readings using a microgravimeter all over the entire pyramid structure. Upon their return to France, Operation Cheops analysed their data using supercomputers and the like, and voids near the horizontal passageway to the Queen's Chamber were identified. This was enough evidence, it seemed, for the Egyptian Department of Antiquities to give the project the go-ahead and to start drilling in the area. I do wonder what was going through the minds of the engineers at the time of the drilling. Perhaps imagining lost burials or the riches of lost treasures. After permission was granted and the holes were drilled, the pair of Frenchmen and their team instead found small chambers or perhaps magazines running parallel to the horizontal passageway, seemingly filled with quartz sand. The purpose of this sand has been much discussed, and here in the book, Brier plants the seed in line with his reconstruction. Why did Himenu fill these sealed chambers with sand? Whatever the drilling team felt about the sand, this perhaps disappointing find did not deter this pair of French explorers. They returned home to retool, to rescan and regroup. Perhaps they could drill deeper if allowed by the powers that be. In this time, however, another group, this time from Japan, proposed scanning the pyramid with ground-penetrating radar. Being led by Dr. Sakuji Yoshimura, who was an Egyptologist, and being backed by the University of Waseda in Tokyo, I apologize if I've mispronounced that, this second group had little in the way of problems in getting their work authorized by the Department of Antiquities in Egypt, and the ground-penetrating radar scan of the Great Pyramid soon began in January 1987. Long story short, this second team were able to confirm with a second technological method the existence of the chambers alongside the Queen's Chamber horizontal passage that were initially discovered by Operation Cheops. There could be no argument there then that the chambers most definitely existed. Unfortunately, further drilling in the area was not permitted by the Department of Antiquities, and no further work has been done with these sand-filled cavities to this very day. What the Japanese team did do, however, was analyse some of the sand that was taken from the chamber via the drilled hole, and they determined that it was quartz sand, something we have briefly touched upon on this channel before. Why had it been imported into the Great Pyramid from far away, and why were there chambers full of it inside the Great Pyramid? To this day, there is no concrete answer, right? The reason I've written all this out is because, in something of a small dramatic reveal, Bob Brier suggests that the French and Japanese teams may have accidentally stumbled onto an element of the pyramid's internal ramp system that Jean-Pierre Houdin proposes is there. This, then, is where things start to get pretty exciting. It's worth mentioning that also at this time, the team presented their findings at the 1988 International Association for Engineering, Geology and the Environment Conference in Athens in Greece. Blimey, that was a mouthful. They presented all of the data we've just covered and then some, and a strange anomaly was mentioned to very little, if in fact zero fanfare, and that was of, quote, zones that are not correlated horizontally and can suggest various building arrangements, spiral constructions. End quote. Hold on to this, we'll be coming back to it very shortly. If you've seen the Khufu Revealed documentary or are at all versed in the internal ramp theory, you will no doubt know what this means, but this is an important piece of the puzzle, but it won't become so until a little later on. Meanwhile, in Brier's detailed Great Pyramid reconstruction timeline, we reach the part where the Grand Gallery comes into play. The Grand Gallery is arguably the most impressive internal feature of the Great Pyramid. Its sheer size, angle, and its dimensions are boggling to the mind. I remember when I first started getting into investigating the pyramids, those halcyon days when I was literally just thinking, you know what? Wonder what's inside those things. Can you even go in a pyramid? And then looking it up online, seeing all those corridors and tunnels and chambers, and the Grand Gallery immediately just hit me as like, what on earth is this absurd structure? Why on earth is it that shape and size? And then you start to think, well, how on earth did they build this thing? And then the eternal question comes inevitably, why did they build this thing? One thing that always sticks with me is this old photograph, I believe, of the Edgar brothers' time inside the Great Pyramid. This is way before the Great Pyramids had electricity, before the passageways had stable steps and footing. Look at this thing. You had to climb up the Queen's Chamber passageway onto smooth stone. No steps, no handrails, just this smooth stone path descending upwards into the pitch black darkness. Imagine by torchlight, perhaps not even being able to see the top of the Grand Gallery, let alone several feet in front of you. Imagine knowing that one wrong move, a slip or a fall, could have you tumbling back down the gallery, resulting in serious injury or even death. Knowing, or at least thinking, that at the very top of this mysterious, intimidating room was the sacred burial chamber of a king from thousands of years into the past. Honestly, the earlier explorers were braver folks than me, but I hope I'm conveying how mysterious the Grand Gallery is. Even now in modern times, where each and every inch of the construction has been pored over, its components such as the Great Step, which has now been replaced, or the grooves running parallel along the gallery, many theories have been presented for the Grand Gallery's purpose, but none that I have seen so far have been as convincing as Jean-Pierre Houdin's theories. Although I will give special mention to the ever-excellent Keith Hamilton, whose Layman's Guide to the Great Pyramid, in its second part, greatly details the potential arrangement of blocking stones being held in a system here, ready for descension down into the ascending corridor upon completion of the pyramid's construction. That is, however, a story for another time. I would direct you to my Chambers, Shafts and Wells video on the Great Pyramid, or even better, directly to Keith's guides, which I honestly think anybody who has any interest in the Great Pyramid should absolutely read. As mysterious and intimidating as the Grand Gallery is, Jean-Pierre cuts through all of this and proposes it serves primarily a utilitarian function. Look further up the structure, as we just described, to the so-called burial chamber of the king, constructed from, as Brier clarifies, 43 huge granite beams, ranging from 30 to more than 60 tons each, were used to build the king's chamber. They had to be raised more than 140 feet onto the pyramid, and nothing like it had ever been done in Egypt. At this point, Brier directs our attention to the tomb painting that was found in the tomb, no less, of Dihitihotep. I'm probably saying that wrong. A pharaoh that reigned around 500 years after Khufu. Let's read out Brier's description of this painting here for a moment. The tomb painting shows a colossal statue of Dihitihotep being pulled by 172 men. The statue rests on a sled, and a worker standing by the statue's feet pours water or oil in front to lubricate the way. There is even an overseer standing on the lap of the statue who is clapping the rhythm to which the men pull. Brier goes on to say that everyone from the military to local volunteers chipped in to help move this statue. Now, I think the point here is that it took 172 bodies to move a statue of a pharaoh that weighed approximately 58 tons. Remember as well that this statue is being moved across the ground. Here, in the case of the Great Pyramid, we have the case of granite blocks being even heavier than the Dihitihotep statue, but also with the added challenge of needing to be lifted 43 meters off the ground. When you lay it out like that, it doesn't bear thinking about. I'd have thrown down my copper chisel, my rope, and have given up and gone home, which probably wouldn't have gone down too well at the time, let's be honest. What was needed was a solution. Having hundreds of men somehow lifting the King's Chamber blocks up off the ground is near-line to, well, completely impossible. However, Jean-Pierre Houdin suggests that the Grand Gallery was used to do just that. This was the purpose of the mysterious structure that had boggled Egyptologists and enthusiasts for so long. Using his computer software, Houdin was able to recreate the proposed counterweight system that he believes Heminu created with the gallery in order to lift the enormous granite blocks in place for the king's chamber. I'm going to quote a lot from Bob Brier's work here, only because he has simplified the explanation of the counterweight system very nicely, whilst also covering all bases of its function and design. Heminu designed a counterweight system to raise the largest blocks, and the heart of the system was the Grand Gallery. Think of the Grand Gallery as a railroad track, with the stone benches as the rails on which the car will run. That's why the Grand Gallery is so narrow, and that's the purpose of the stone benches. Now imagine one of the huge granite blocks at the bottom of the ramp, with ropes attached to the block that run up the ramp. At the other end are attached to a trolley car at the top of the Grand Gallery. The trolley is loaded with 4.5-ton granite blocks that serve as counterweights. When the brake is released, the trolley slides down the Grand Gallery and the large granite beam is pulled up the ramp. It's a bit more complicated than that, but not much. Jean-Pierre began to fill in more and more of the details. To reduce the friction between the bottom of the car and the bench, remember the Egyptians didn't use wheels, and ensure that the counterweights moved smoothly down the Grand Gallery, rollers made of logs were placed across the width of the gallery, their ends resting on the benches. The rollers thus form skids very much like those used to slide boxes of groceries from delivery trucks down into the basement of supermarkets. The 28 pairs of slots in the benches, spaced 1.5 cubits apart, were used as part of a braking system for the trolleys and counterweights, as well as for keeping the logs in line. By inserting wood beams with carved ratchets into the slots, the trolley could be held stationary at almost any point in the gallery. Addressing some of the residual evidence that is still present in the Grand Gallery today, Brier and Houdin present the following explanations. Regarding gouges in the Grand Gallery walls, of which we have discussed before on the channel, I think it's even proposed that there may have been a low ceiling here at some point. To these, the theory here instead attributes that they once held wooden tracks to help keep the trolleys moving up and down the gallery in line. Likewise, similar marks on the stone benches can be seen running the entire length of the Grand Gallery. These look more like stains or grease marks rather than gouges. Brier calls them racing stripes, which is pretty funny. These are attributed to lubrication that would have been placed between the stones and the trolley itself to help facilitate its smooth movement up and down the gallery. Finally, the blocking stones, some of which are still in place and plugging the ascending passage of the Great Pyramid, were the 4.5-ton granite blocks that Brier referred to as being part of the trolley counterweight system. Once the system was no longer needed, the blocks were released and they slid down the gallery and into their resting place at the bottom of the passage. One of the strongest pieces of evidence, in my opinion, is the original shape of the so-called Great Step that existed at the top of the Grand Gallery. Sadly, this has been repaired in modern times. Seemingly, it was thought that the step was damaged and it had been restored. Or if the word restored rubs you the wrong way, then perhaps improved is the right choice, having been also expanded upon with another smaller step and a railing, making it much easier for tourists to access the King's Chamber without having to clamber over this thing. This photograph, taken in 1911, shows the previous state of the so-called Great Step. Houdin's theory proposes that this groove was in place to guide the rope attached to the ballast stone, the weight that hung down through the gallery and the trolley and into the ascending passageway. As for the sheer height of the Grand Gallery, the theory recognizes this and advises that the height was required due to the size and shape of the items being brought up on the counterweight on the other side of the pyramid. This diagram here does a great job of clarifying this, for not only does the counterweight help lift the blocks, but also helps lift them into their correct placement, including the roof of the King's Chamber. Therefore, the roof of the Grand Gallery, for lack of a better term, would need to remain open to allow the free flowing of ropes until every part of the King's Chamber was in its place. Speaking then of the constructed King's Chamber, let's move onwards and upwards and address the chamber itself, its ceiling and the subsequent chambers which exist above it, and how the theory of Jean-Pierre Houdin deals with these elements of the Great Pyramid. Off the bat, it's definitely worth mentioning that Brier states that the granite coffer was placed into the King's Chamber as it was being built. I mention this because there are those who have proposed the coffer was slid into place as part of a funerary procession after the passing of the king. In fact, I think Houdin himself later proposed a second set of funerary tunnels accessing the king's chamber, but let's not complicate things here more than we need to. This is something that always tantalizes my imagination, so no doubt we will dedicate more time to this in another video. In fact, we've covered it briefly in the videos on the North Face corridor, and the Ancient Architects channel has several videos which cover a potential secret entrance into the king's chamber, but as I said, another story for another time. I'll pop a link in the description. Brier asks the question of the king's chamber ceiling. Despite being made of the most enormous granite slabs, how can it hold all of the weight above it bearing down? The remainder of the pyramid's immense mass that in our reconstruction timeline was about to be piled on top of it. Here the concept of the series of relieving chambers comes into play. Now, with my internet skeptic head immediately switched back on, I pulled on my naysayer cap as it were, and I began to think, well, the more you look at these structures of so-called relieving chambers, the more it looks like that they aren't actually relieving anything at all. It's joked about that each relieving chamber only relieves the air in the space above it before the next ceiling, but how do Brier and Houdin see it? There's perhaps more to things here that often gets brought up online. This is addressed directly by Brier on page 110 of The Secret of the Great Pyramid. Brier agrees that the so-called relieving chambers aren't actually relieving anything at all. The enormous granite slabs of each chamber's floor or ceiling would have had to have been painstakingly hauled into place by the counterweight system running up and down the grand gallery. The important component of this entire internal structure is its roof. 11 pairs of huge limestone blocks forming an inverted V, writes Brier. This is what is deflecting the weight of the pyramid stone away from the king's chamber. Without this, the granite beams of the king's chamber's ceiling, massive as they may be, would absolutely fall apart under the pressure of the remaining mass of the Great Pyramid above them. Why then create this system of relieving chambers at all? In a roundabout kind of way, these were required because of the grand gallery. If the huge limestone V-shaped roof was placed above the king's chamber first ceiling, or indeed if it took the place of the king's chamber granite ceiling, then the additional forces that the ceiling is deflecting away from the king's chamber would instead be aimed in part at the grand gallery, which could not withstand such additional force and would inevitably collapse. This then is the reason why these so-called relieving chambers exist, according to the theory, to raise the height of this ceiling further up into the pyramid, where the grand gallery can be avoided and the forces deflected by the roof can be safely deflected into the core masonry of the pyramid, which is strong enough to absorb the additional load. If you're watching along rather than just listening, here's a handy diagram from the book which shows the vaulted ceiling as if it was placed too low down, with the forces it's deflecting now disastrously being sent into the space occupied by the grand gallery. Now then, what next? Well, this is where things really get going in regards to the true meat of the internal ramp theory. With the king's chamber completed, the half-constructed pyramid was about 200 feet high. The external ramp, the one being built in stages that we mentioned earlier, is now getting too long and too steep to be of any use. Using more familiar terminology, Brier advises that if the gradient of the ramp needs to be kept below 8% in order for blocks to be carried up along it, they keep the ramp at that incline of 8%, and to make it long enough to reach the top of the designed pyramid height, then this ramp would be miles long, and the volume of material used to create such a ramp would rival the Great Pyramid itself. You may have heard these kinds of claims about such an unrealistically massive ramp online from people who propose the pyramid was made by aliens or by using levitation magic or telekinesis and all sorts of mad theories, but this ramp part of what they're saying is at least true, it seems. Such a ramp would need to be so absurdly massive that its scale and even its existence is hard to imagine. On top of that, there is literally basically no evidence of this ramp ever existing. So without wanting to ask stupidly obvious questions this far into the deep dive, how did they build the Great Pyramid without such a ramp? Brier and of course Houdin believe that this was done with some sort of internal ramp, and we'll get to the particulars of the design of that ramp in the coming minutes. Brier is quick to point out that there are no surviving records regarding construction left from the times of ancient Egypt. He says, for 3,000 years they were building big, but no plan survives. We have medical papyri, literary papyri, business transactions, love poetry, but no construction plans, and we don't know why. He does go on to propose something of a reason, however. He talks about a trench to the east of the Great Pyramid, what we know today as the Trial Passages. These passages cut into the rock are believed to be something of a replica of the ascending-descending passageway cross-section of the Great Pyramid itself. The bottom of the ascending passageway in the Trial Passages even narrows in the exact same way as the Great Pyramid. It's worth noting that the Trial Passage corridors are also aligned perfectly north-south, just like the corridors in the Great Pyramid. Brier proposes that these physical tunnels are construction plans for the Great Pyramid. Instead of drawing up plans on paper, the ancient Egyptians carved theirs out of the ground. Whilst I think a set of practice tunnels constructed, assumingly before the pyramid, is a wise decision to make, I don't agree that this can pass for the equivalent of actual construction plans. Maybe I am interpreting things too literally here, but there is much more to the Great Pyramid than the ascending-descending passage, yet no further trial carvings exist other than this, it seems. Brier brings us to the ancient writings of Herodotus. In his work, he states, in the earlier stages of construction, the Great Pyramid of Giza was like a step pyramid, and that an external series of levers were used to lift the remaining stones into place. Now, it's easy to imagine a stepped core, like Dzoser's pyramid at Saqqara, but what Herodotus may be referring to here is simply what we see today. And the blocks, he says, were levered into place, perhaps were the now missing facing stones made of fine Tura limestone. Here is an illustration of a potential design for the lever system Herodotus refers to, called a shaduf. Although Brier does suggest that space would certainly be limited on the surface of the pyramid for such a system to function, so perhaps something like this existing is not too probable after all. Diodorus, assuming I'm saying his name correctly, talks of mounds being used, which Brier equates to ramps. Evidence is then provided for other ramps used in building throughout ancient Egypt, and he summarizes the two mainstream theories regarding the Great Pyramid's construction. We have already touched upon the possibility of a single external ramp. The fact that this theory is the most common is nothing short of frustrating because, well, as we've already covered, there is no trace of this ramp anywhere. Surely something so big would leave some sort of trace somewhere. The second theory propositioned by Egyptologists is that of a spiral ramp, which snakes around the outside of the pyramid. This isn't too dissimilar, at least at first glance, to what Jean-Pierre proposes, but there are some vital flaws here. To have a ramp that, in Brier's own words, corkscrews around the pyramid like a mountain road, you disregard the requirement for constant surveying of the pyramid as it is built over the years. Continuous measurement of the edges of the pyramid would have been required to ensure that the angle of construction was remaining constant throughout. Deviations would result in quite a wonky looking pyramid, and that wouldn't be any good at all. Such an external corkscrew of a ramp then would not allow these measurements to take place, and therefore it is extremely unlikely that one ever existed. What then does Houdin propose exactly? On screen is now an original drawing from 1999 from Jean-Pierre's father, Henry Houdin. This was his original internal ramp design, inspired by the corkscrew of the second external ramp theory. Henry proposed what it may look like if it was instead buried inside the pyramid, and therefore not interfering with ongoing surveying and measuring tasks at the pyramid's exterior throughout construction. Another prototype from Houdin Sr. fantastically proposed 4 separate internal ramps, which is very interesting to think about, but this idea didn't really go any further than this. Perfecting and expanding on his father's theories, Jean-Pierre Houdin has spent thousands of hours reconstructing the Great Pyramid inside various computer programs. The sheer effort involved in this really does boggle the mind, but it would be difficult to say that Houdin's hard work has not paid off. Here is a good one-shot model of what he proposes. Here is the so-called internal ramp, exposed here as the pyramid is still under construction. The path for the ramp avoids all internal structures completely, including the shaft systems. On each corner, crane systems help to turn blocks, usually pushed by workers, around tight 90-degree corners. This is all well and good on paper, but what are the chances this actually exists? In the year 2000, and I'm not sure if this was pure coincidence or if Henry Houdin was touting the internal ramp theory to French individuals who have previously been involved somehow with the Great Pyramid, but he met with one of the individuals who many years earlier had been involved with the gravimetric scans carried out under the project entitled Operation Cheops. Henry showed this individual, Pierre de Letty, a geologist, the diagrams of the internal ramp created by Jean-Pierre, and it was immediately a light bulb moment, as it were. You may remember way back earlier in the video when the French and Japanese teams were working on the cavities alongside the Queen's Chamber horizontal passage. Towards the end of that section, we covered how findings were presented in the 1988 International Association for Engineering, Geology and the Environment Conference in Athens, Greece. And breathe. They mentioned an anomaly within the pyramid that they had noticed with gravimetric scans, but nobody at the conference seemed particularly interested, and that was that. This anomaly was now presented to Henry Houdin. The picture is on screen, and you can no doubt imagine the excitement at seeing this scan for the first time. Now, I'm just going to warn you in advance, I am going to absolutely butcher this name, but the Houdins were put in touch with somebody called Hoi Young Boy, whose calculations resulted in the image that was produced. It is understandable that the father and son team wanted to know more. Hoi Young Boy, however, confirmed that the theory they worked with way back during the time of Operation Cheops was that they were picking up some sort of trace of an external corkscrew ramp, the type of one that Brier sought to debunk earlier in his book, and for which he gave evidence. So if the two Houdins were not looking at trace remains of an external ramp, here then surely the scan could only mean one thing. Finally, they had discovered the first piece of evidence that an internal ramp existed within the Great Pyramid. This image had been sat, filed away somewhere for years and years. As exciting as it no doubt was, this would not be enough to go on, and more evidence of the internal ramp would be needed. Another perhaps not very strong but very interesting piece of evidence in this vein is something that Jean-Pierre noticed whilst looking at the Great Pyramid from the viewpoint as if he was standing near the Sphinx. I wonder if those watching as well as listening can tell from the photograph on screen what I'm talking about before I've said it. Looking up at the side of the Great Pyramid from this angle, one can see what appears to be faint traces of an ascending gradient going across the surface of the Great Pyramid. Jean-Pierre proposes that the internal ramp should be far enough inside the pyramid to not cause this kind of anomaly, but here it is all the same. Again, not concrete evidence that what Brier and Houdin are proposing is correct, but super interesting all the same. It is at this point in the book that Bob Brier turns to what is known as the notch. Now, we have covered the notch on this channel before, in fact all the way back on the first ever video that I did, but we did not really explore the makeup of the notch and its potential significance to the internal ramp theory. So a brief recap is due, I would say. The notch is, well, at first glance, a notch on the northeastern corner of the Great Pyramid, approximately 275 feet above ground. This flattened surface, where it appears the rocks have fallen away, coincidentally or otherwise, is exactly where Jean-Pierre Houdin predicts one of his ramp's turns would lie. That's not all, however. It's possible to go inside the notch. A small opening in the pyramid's core masonry allows you inside a small cave-like interior room. So what is the significance of all this? We know it lines up to where Jean-Pierre Houdin believes the internal ramp turned a corner, but there is more going on here. It's absolutely worth mentioning that the size of the notch, at least that what is visible from the exterior of the pyramid, measures in at 5 cubits squared. Jean-Pierre Perrin, one of the people involved in the Operation Cheops work, claimed to have seen a fox up on the notch, and he watched as the fox disappeared back inside the pyramid. It is theorized in Brier's book that the fox reached the notch by climbing inside some sort of cavity within the pyramid's core masonry, possibly even the internal ramp itself. The team saw no reason why a fox would climb all the way up to the notch on the external face of the pyramid at a height of 275 feet. This is of course only anecdotal evidence. Brier ended up getting permission to climb the Great Pyramid and enter the notch, as seen in the excellent documentary Khufu Revealed. Brier was able to photograph and measure the notch, which he says seemed to be much bigger here than he was expecting it to be. Then he rather bravely stepped inside the opening in the core masonry, following in the footsteps of the supposed fox, to find a cave-like interior that he also found to be much bigger than he originally imagined. Interestingly, after exploring inside this space, Brier writes that it certainly wasn't the internal ramp. On top of this statement, Brier also writes, "As I was measuring the cave for Jean-Pierre, I noticed a second crevice at floor level inside the cave. It was formed by 2 blocks not being set right next to each other, leaving a space of about 12 inches. But the little crevice extended well beyond the first 2 blocks, forming a small tunnel that ran for at least 15 feet. I couldn't squeeze inside, so I took a few photos and started my descent." Despite the irregularities experienced and the lack of correlation with what he saw versus what he expected to see at the notch, Jean-Pierre was more than happy with what was discovered by Brier inside of the notch and has worked this into the model used to support the theory. Brier talks of the potential for cranes to have been erected on other platforms like this around the outside of the pyramid. This would certainly fit in with the whole design and function proposed, but again there is still no real evidence for this. The whole thing with the notch that intrigues me the most is the mysterious crevice that Brier says goes for at least 15 feet into the pyramid's core masonry. I think it would be very interesting indeed, if not entirely cheap on the scale of pyramid exploration costs, to place a small camera down this crevice. Even if it doesn't go anywhere, it can give us a really good look at the Great Pyramid's internal masonry. For now, let's look back at where we are in the reconstruction timeline at this point. The roof had gone on to the King's Chamber, as well as the multiple relieving chambers, and the use of the proposed internal ramp was underway. But what then of the existing external ramp that was used to build the main bulk of the Great Pyramid's base? Jean-Pierre Houdin proposes that the external ramp was dismantled bit by bit as the pyramid construction continued with the internal ramp, and the stone from the external ramp was used by the pyramid builders to become part of the core masonry of the pyramid. This is why, says Houdin, that there is no trace of any enormous ramp today. And so the Great Pyramid's construction continued for several more years in this fashion. It was at this point, with the pyramid nearing total completion, that Brier and Houdin proposed that disaster struck. These cracks shown here in the King's Chamber ceiling can still be seen today. Obviously, this is a photo. They are incredibly unnerving. As of the time of recording this video, I have not been inside the King's Chamber myself yet, but mere photographs of the cracks in the ceiling make me feel incredibly uneasy. Brier writes here that he thinks Himenu experienced the same feeling of unease, perhaps, of course, with an additional feeling of horror at the prospect of the Great Pyramid collapsing and his life's work being left in ruins, not to mention the fury of the pharaoh. There are many theories as to how and when the cracks in the King's Chamber ceiling appeared, and whether they are related to other settling or movement that has been noted elsewhere in the pyramid. For the sake of this theory, however, I will omit these other ideas, but would be happy to explore them in future episodes if there is an interest in doing so. For the sake of thoroughly examining the theory at hand, I will go along with Brier's timeline that the ceiling beams of the King's Chamber were discovered to be cracked a few years before the Great Pyramid was totally completed. It is at this point in the timeline that Brier proposes the tunnel connecting the Grand Gallery to the first chamber of the relieving chambers above the King's Chamber was excavated. This tunnel was dug out by brave souls. There could be no knowing what kind of damage lay beyond, or whether the whole thing was going to come down on them at any second. As we know, however, none of the so-called relieving chambers collapsed. The cracks in the King's Chamber ceiling did not get any worse either. It is proposed here that the workers plastered the cracks in order to show any fresh widening of the crack, but this did not occur, and construction of the pyramid continued. The masses of core masonry could now proceed unhindered now that the internal structures were completed. A few pages later, Brier does suggest to us that there was no way that Himenu knew at the time what had caused the beams of the King's Chamber ceiling, as well as a few beams in the first and second relieving chambers, to crack. It wasn't until a bit later on in the internal ramp theory's development, when Houdin had teamed up with Dassault Systems to create a fully interactive 3D model of the pyramid, did they attempt to explain what had caused the cracks. Using one of Dassault Systems, again apologies if I'm butchering that French name, computer programs entitled Simulia, which exists to perform virtual strength tests on airplane wings and on cars and so on, using plans from the pyramid from way back in the Operation Cheops days, and mixing this with Houdin's proposed pyramid construction methods, as well as research conducted into the properties of the limestone and the granite used in the construction of the Great Pyramid, all this data was then used to painstakingly reconstruct the Great Pyramid of Giza using the Simulia software. However, something interesting happened. After much work, the Great Pyramid construction was completed inside the Simulia program, yet the beams of the King's Chamber and lower relieving chambers did not crack. In fact, there's a funny little line in the book here when one of the computer engineers telephones Jean-Pierre Houdin to say, "Jean-Pierre, we are unable to break these beams." The giant limestone rafter system at the top of the series of relieving chambers appeared to be doing its job as intended. A very interesting fact is that the computer engineers running the software simulated an earthquake, which also did not crack the beams. Now, of course, we need to remember that this is just a computer simulation at work, but it is interesting that an earthquake did not cause the beams to crack inside the simulation, as outside of our focus on Brier and the internal ramp theory, it is often an earthquake that is touted as an explanation for the cracked beams that we are currently talking about. Eventually, it was discovered that there was a 12mm discrepancy in the placement of the limestone rafters. The rafters had either shifted or settled on the northern side, enough to put considerable pressure on the stones beneath the rafters, as well as outwardly into the rest of the core masonry as originally intended. This discrepancy was adjusted inside the simulator, and now significant signs of pressure were present on the King's Chamber beams, where there had been none before. However, this was still not enough pressure to cause the great granite beams to break, according to the simulation. The entire pyramid was analysed once more, and again after much work it was noticed that the southern side of the King's Chamber had settled and was slightly lower than the northern wall. Now, this settlement is estimated to be at around 3 centimetres, which is a considerable amount. Jean-Pierre Houdin even proposes a cause for this: the removal of the external ramp. When the external ramp was dismantled and added into the core masonry of the pyramid, its removal allowed the southern side of the pyramid to settle slightly without having the enormous ramp pushing up against it. This, Houdin proposes, is the cause of the 3 centimetres worth of settling on the southern side of the King's Chamber. Couple this with the slight 12mm off placement of the rafters far above at the topmost part of the relieving chambers, and this combination of factors caused the beams to crack. The pressure alone wasn't quite enough, but when the King's Chamber started to settle a few years after its construction, the granite beams could not bend and therefore they cracked under the additional pressure. Houdin and his team calculated, through the no doubt infinitely time-consuming reconstruction of the pyramid within their software, that it was around 375 feet of completion that the King's Chamber beams cracked. This happened after the King's Chamber and so-called relieving chambers and rafters had long been in place. Further to this, the first and second course of relieving chamber ceilings also cracked. The first at 420 feet of completed pyramid and the second at 450 feet. Thankfully, despite all of this, there was not that much pyramid left to go, at least not enough to crack any more beams and cause any more problems. The pyramid then was now reaching its final stages of construction. Due to the length of the sides of the pyramid now being drastically smaller, the internal ramp had to be built steeper. This is dismissed as ever being a problem, with Brier declaring that the increased gradient, of which percentage I'm not sure, would have had no bearing on the raising of blocks. It would have made the ascent more difficult, but it would not have made it impossible. The final aspect of the pyramid's construction then would be the placing of the original Pyramidion on the top of the structure. This is unfortunately lost to us today, but it is proposed that a fine limestone capstone once stood at the topmost part of the Great Pyramid, coated in an alloy of silver and gold that is called electrum. Brier states that this capping stone could have weighed up to 15 tons. How was such a massive block lifted up to the very top of the pyramid? Jean-Pierre proposes a clever solution to this. The capstone was pulled up the original low-gradient external ramp when it was possible to do so. Since that point, the Pyramidion had been sat at the current level of the pyramid's construction height, and has been raised bit by bit alongside the growing height of the pyramid over the years. We can see from the diagram here taken from one of Jean-Pierre's computer simulations that the Pyramidion stone exists inside some sort of wooden cradle. Ropes suspending the Pyramidion can be twisted around, which slowly raises the level of the hanging stone so that new blocks can be placed underneath it. It's rather ingenious in its simplicity, however, I do not know of any hard evidence that can help back up the existence of such a winch system. That really brings the reconstruction timeline to a close, and more or less closes out all of the evidence for the internal ramp theory, at least in regards to what the author and the architect had gathered by the book's publication date in 2008. The story of how Brier and Houdin made the theory public, and in conjunction with which companies and other interested parties they made this happen, is probably beyond the scope of this video. At least it is because of the existence of the Khufu Reveal documentary, which is arguably a much better way of ingesting all of this information. I couldn't exclude an analysis of Brier and Houdin's publication from this channel, however, as it is one of the more popular theories around the Great Pyramid, so I apologise to those seasoned pyramid veterans who perhaps have not learned all that much from this particular video. As I said at the start of the video, however, I would like to spend some more time going through Jean-Pierre's blog, or his publications rather, as an addition to this current report, as he has a lot of very interesting ideas that add and expand to this proposal as published here. So then, moving on to part 3, how then was the internal ramp theory received? Criticisms of the internal ramp theory. I don't think that it would be unfair to say that in general, in the pyramid community online, for a lack of a better way to describe it, Jean-Pierre Houdin's theories seem to be well respected. He has clearly thought out his suggestions and has spent a lot of time perfecting his theory. Remember, this video is based off the initial theory and the book published to support that theory. Since then, Houdin has kept his theory up to date, more recently publishing papers I should say, on how the discovered voids by the Scanned Pyramids project interact with his ramp design. In fact, History for Granite has a video from the latter end of 2022 that covers this perfectly. No doubt I'm preaching to the choir by mentioning History for Granite if you're this far into one of my videos, but you may not have seen that particular video, so I'll link it below. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that I've not seen Houdin's work come under much critical scrutiny, and the theory continues to have relevance even today. As we said at the start though, every theory has its detractors, however, and I was able to unearth some criticism. The first I came across was from everyone's favourite Egyptologist, Zahi Hawass. An article on the History News Network website reveals a throwaway line from 2007, where Hawass states that pyramids built directly after Khufu's do not have any evidence of an internal ramp. It seems almost trite to analyse this small comment, but I've seen footage of and I've read Hawass doing this a few times, that being quickly shutting down something with circumstantial counter-evidence. So let's assume then Khafre and Mekare's pyramids do not have an internal ramp system. Okay, something that we don't know for certain, but yeah, it's unlikely. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Khufu's pyramid also does not. The other pyramids at Giza also do not possess such intricate internal passageways and chambers as Khufu's pyramid. By Hawass's logic here, Khufu's pyramid shouldn't have these because the other two don't either. That's probably a ham-fisted example, but you get what I'm saying here. An immediate wave of the hand and the theory is dismissed, which isn't great, to be honest. It's also worth noting towards the end of the book written by Bob Brier, Brier and Houdin's team's request to perform thermal photography on Khufu's pyramid to help confirm the internal ramp theory was denied by Hawass 3 times, 2 of the applications being denied on what seems like minor technicalities. I appreciate the purpose that the Egyptian Antiquities Department serves, and I also appreciate the need to regulate exploration of such an important monument, but reading about stuff like this happening is incredibly frustrating. In fact, it's on this major downer that Bob Brier's book actually ends, which is a bizarre choice. In the same History Newsnet article I just mentioned, author John Roma is also quoted as criticising the internal ramp theory. History Newsnet quotes Roma on the following: "In reality, huge amounts of well-documented facts exist concerning the genuine building methods employed. Quite simply, we see the outline where the ramp ends in a quarry." Without wanting to sound like an internet conspiracy theorist about to get his channel regulated to BitChute or Odyssey, I would like to ask Roma where these huge amounts of well-documented facts can be found. I don't think it would be untoward to say that nobody truly really knows for sure how the pyramids were built. Houdin could indeed also be completely wrong, but to declare certainly that the opposite is true and there are huge amounts of well-documented facts about quote-unquote genuine building methods, is simply not true. Whatever we may know about the people who were at Giza and what they left behind, I am not debating. The things that are continuing to be unearthed at and around Giza are absolutely fascinating, but if we knew for certain and held huge amounts of well-documented facts about how the pyramids were built, then we wouldn't be here right now discussing any of this in this video. Digging a little deeper online, I found the website of retired American engineer Frank Steiger, apologies Frank if I'm getting your name wrong, who has been critical of Houdin's internal ramp theory. It's worth mentioning before I get into what he has to say that Steiger is also, rather coincidentally, critical on his website of both Zahi Hawass and John Romer, who I've just mentioned. This is because Steiger has his own ramp theory, one of a movable ramp, which is something I only came across for the first time when researching this video, but going into this now is, again, beyond the scope of this video. I will come back to Steiger's theories and give them a good read in the future. For now, let's take a look at what criticisms he has of the internal ramp theory. He holds back no punches in immediately going for the jugular, stating that the film entitled Unlocking the Great Pyramid, Khufu revealed, Brier and Houdin found zero evidence for an internal ramp. From here, he picks at the construction of the ramp. The Houdin theory does not explain how the ramps were covered. The illustrations in his book, Khufu, The Secrets Behind the Building of the Great Pyramid, clearly show the internal ramps being overlaid with a corbelled ceiling. However, there is no explanation of how this could be done. Are the stone blocks carried up the stepwise internal ramp and then somehow placed to form a ceiling at the end of the tunnel? The illustrations in his book show a massive stone structure above the tunnel. But how did it get there? Mr. Houdin's theory requires that finishing facing stones be placed at each level as work progresses upward. The complex angles involved and the zigzag configuration of the internal ramp make this an extremely complex, difficult and time-consuming task. Steiger does have a point. None of this is explained in any of the publications we've covered thus far that were originally released to support the theory. On the other hand, it is perhaps unrealistic to expect more in-depth technical details when no hard evidence still exists for even the more high-level elements of the internal ramp theory. But Steiger is right here. In the book we've covered in this video, in a literary sense, Brier paints with wide brush strokes in order to compensate for these kinds of gaps in the hard details that simply aren't there, and that's fine to a degree. But now, as I'm working on this project, I'm surprised that the theories of Houdin and Brier, at least in this form, do not face more criticism. Perhaps it's because it seems a lot of Egyptology also paints with these same wide brushstrokes. Food for thought there. Steiger does go on to level many more criticisms against the theory, including that the number of wooden cranes needed on each right angle corner is unrealistic, and that the design of the cranes strong enough to move blocks with their desired force would mean that the cranes would be considerably larger than what could fit on the right angle of a particular corner without getting in the way of everything else around it. He also addresses how the internal ramps were lit. Were the men pushing and pulling stones up inside the internal ramps in darkness, or were there torches in use? In an Ancient Origins article on the various potential pyramid ramp systems, Jonothan Perrin, no, not the John Perrin you may be thinking of, addresses the internal ramp theory from Houdin. Expanding on a quote from Egyptologist David Jeffries, who called the internal ramp theory, quote, far-fetched and horribly complicated, Perrin wrote the following. Instead of having 4 internal ramps and corridors, the Great Pyramid would actually have the equivalent of dozens of internal chambers. Instead of having one impressive and corbelled grand gallery, it would have the equivalent of over 30 grand galleries winding up throughout the monument, all corbelled corridors of impressive masonry. It seems absurd, considering how amazing a feat the Grand Gallery itself was, that there would still be 30 more of them to discover somewhere inside the pyramid, all connected together. And despite much indirect evidence, Brier and Houdin have not found any specific hard data for their ramp. Even their much-lauded microgravimetric scan could be interpreted differently. Once again, I think the author here does raise some valid points. Despite Houdin's closeness to the ongoing Scan Pyramids project and his more recent work tying the Big Void into the internal ramp theory, as covered in the History for Granite video we mentioned earlier, it's still very hard to escape the fact that none of the apparent internal ramps have shown up at all on any scans performed by the Scan Pyramids teams. When you take the sheer scale of these ramps, which I think Perrin amply portrays in the quote we just read, and compare it to, say, the size of the North Face corridor, which in the grand scheme of things is fairly small, yet the latter was picked up by the Scan Pyramids when the former, all these ramps, wasn't. Their absence here is a pretty big problem. And I think, well, that brings this video to a close. Personally, I think that Houdin's theories are fantastic. They've gone far beyond what we've outlined here in the original book, published with Bob Brier, but Houdin remains active and a well-respected member of the research community. Do I think that the internal ramp theory is possible? Yes, I do. And I do think a lot of it makes more sense than some of the more traditional, dare I say, mainstream Egyptological ramp construction theories. There is a glut of alternative construction theories for the Great Pyramid, ranging from the mundane to the frankly absurd, and Jean-Pierre's is easily one of the most thought out and convincing. Bob Brier makes a fascinating case for Houdin's theory through his book, Secret of the Great Pyramid, but there is, unfortunately, the matter of the missing concrete evidence. This is a problem that plagues a lot of research into anything Great Pyramid related, to be fair, but for something as massive and as groundbreaking as Houdin's internal ramp theory, I would expect more evidence to exist than what we currently have. I have infinite respect for Houdin and the amount of work that he's put into his theories. Likewise to Bob Brier for lending his name and his support to Houdin and allowing him a way into the world of Egyptology, legitimizing the theory, I suppose, as it were, and for writing the book we've covered in this video too, of course. Funny enough, I saw on Reddit, of all places, a comment about Brier having strayed away from support of the internal ramp theory in recent years, but I was unable to corroborate this or find out any more about it. If anyone knows anything more about this, then I would be very interested in finding out more. So, what do you think? Have you read Bob Brier's book? Do you support the internal ramp theory? I would love to read your thoughts on the subject. The discourse on these comment sections is always my favourite part of putting these videos online, so please let me know what you think. Thank you if you've watched this to the end, because this has been a long one, so if you've watched it all the way through but are not subscribed to the channel, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow, and I'd love to have you on board for the ongoing journey of discovering. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. All the best. Ta-ra now.